So the topic is, can the mind be quiet? But we're taking a little bit of a side angle to this topic. And I will speak first for about 20 minutes. Then Cory will speak for about 20 minutes. And then Gianni will speak for 20 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion. And part of that discussion will also include you who is watching this from a distance. And I'm taking a little bit of a detour on can the mind be quiet, because the tangent that I'm doing is aligned with what Stephen Smith talked about yesterday, and where the quiet mind is related to the human potential. And I feel that's really an essential concept. So what is our human potential? And I feel we have to look at that because on a first level you could ask, now why do you live? And then the answer would be, well, the purpose of life is to be happy. But I would say that, and from Krishnamurti's work you can say, well, actually happiness, according to him, but I think I would agree with that, is not about being happy. Happiness is like a side product. It's like a consequence of a certain amount, a fleeting thing, an innocent pleasure, they call it in one of the videos. But it's to put, if we put consciously that our most important purpose of as a human being is to seek happiness, we might miss out on something. So then you could say the second thing, maybe, that could be the purpose or the main objective of life is to end human suffering. Of course, that's a little bit the Buddhist concept. And I would agree more on that, but nevertheless, I feel that it's although we haven't defined suffering, which I will do in a moment, but I still feel that is one step short of maybe something else. It's almost like, okay, you want to have, on one hand, of course, you want to end physical suffering in the world. You would like to end that there's enough food, that there's enough clothing, there's enough shelter, there's enough medical provisions. So on that level, I think we agree. Then there's the more complex element. Can human suffering end as far as the psychological suffering, meaning the stress, the anxiety, the conflicts, the endless worries, the competitiveness. So you could say, okay, if that comes to an end, so if the physical suffering has come to an end, if the psychological suffering has come to an end, are we then fulfilling our full potential? What next? Is it just the ending of that? In order for what? And I feel that is somehow the question, where the question starts to meet the question of the quiet mind. Because my understanding, and I think I can quote Krishnamurti thereon, is that all of that is just more or less a groundwork to have space in one life, that spaciousness, and that silence, and that something can manifest in that silence, which is more related to the meaning of life or the purpose of life. And that something, of course, from a Krishnamurti perspective, is not some kind of invented God or some kind of romantic notion or some kind of self-hypnosis or something like that. So now, of course, I'm not equipped or able to say much about that empty space, what that would be, but I might be able to say some things that it might not be. But I hold that for the latter part of what I'm talking about. Now, why do I think this is important? Because I feel we're organizing our society in a way how we understand what the purpose of life is. Like, we're organizing society to optimize pleasure, or to optimize happiness, or to minimize suffering. But Krishnamurti, in its work, he would make a very clear statement. He would say, the purpose of society is for the fruition of humanity. And so that it exists to give freedom to each individual, and that they have the opportunity to awaken the highest intelligence. That's a direct quote. And that is, I feel, is important, because when we think as society as a whole, as I think we should be, because as we can see, there are problems with the society as it is now. And the society has come into being through a variety of processes, which I will try to look at. And in 20 minutes, of course, it will be a limited viewpoint on that, and only focusing in on certain areas. But the society obviously has come into being because of certain reasons. And the individual has come into being because of certain reasons. And all of this might currently not be situated in a way that it facilitates the growth of each human being. So now, and maybe one note to make, because if you look at Krishnamurti and the relationship between the society and the individual, it's unclear. He says in some places he's very adamant. The society is what it is because of the individual. And in other places he would also say, well, of course, but the individual is influenced by society. But nevertheless, he seems to be quite adamant that he expects that in his view, a change will not come about, the fundamental change that's required will not come about through changing the outside, through social engineering or through changing the organizational structure. He says the fundamental change that's required requires an inward change. Now, I mean, that's still up for quite a bit of debate, right? Because you could say, well, even Krishnamurti acts somehow contradicting to that. I mean, if that's what he thinks, why does he start a school, which is clearly an outward thing and not an inward thing? So I'm not saying that Krishnamurti is wrong or something, but I'm just saying that you could debate this much further. What comes first? Good educational institutions, so you get different kind of kids, and then the different kind of kids will then create different society, or what's the chicken and what's the egg here? So, well, I leave that in the middle for the moment, but I'm focusing mostly on the premise, or I'm going to talk mostly on the premise of that actually that inner change is mostly important. So, and in order to look at that, I feel two things are important. As we saw, or for those of you who saw the discussion that was just being streamed of the discussion between Krishnamurti and Jonas Salk, you could see they were exploring evolution. And what is the role of evolution in this? Undoubtedly, of course, we are a product of evolution. We are what we are because through a sequence of events where there were random mutations and there was a natural selection. And for some reason that ended us up here. Now also more clearly it becomes that there's another movement at the same time, which is the cultural evolution, which is more, since society is so interconnected and we live in societies and we live in close proximity with other people, there is, like, we influence each other's thoughts, and which is then somehow the cultural evolution. We stand within our culture. Now, we have seen, and we've discussed that this has been discussed in previous conferences that we have done, that in order for our species to be adaptive, it needed to make many shortcuts. And that evolution, the evolutionary selection was not necessarily a selection that selected upon truth or on accuracy. It just selected upon that what survived the best, what could adapt the best. And like things that are programmed deep into us, and probably already programmed into us from a reptilian brain, and even before, are things like that it's better to be safe than sorry. You know, you don't wait to be sure that your enemy is an enemy. You better hit first. For humans, there are other things that play out now, is that we are determining who's in our in-group and who's in our out-group. That's another bias. So you have to see who are with you and who are against you, because you need to know who your friends are and who your enemies are. So that's what Krishnamurti called conditioning. That's a product of evolution, which has, because if you function that way, those mutations that function that way would just survive the best. Those who can quicker determine who is the enemy will hit better. But that the leftover of that blueprint, that program, is still running in us. So it's important to acknowledge that we have features in us, that our brain, the structure of how it's operates, is based upon that. Who is your enemy and who are your friends? So all of that is like they called cognitive biases. A whole series of cognitive biases have been determined. Now, somewhere in Krishnamurti's work, in his discussions with David Moody, at a certain point, and I don't know if it's David Bohm who says it first or Krishnamurti who says it first, or David Bohm says it and Krishnamurti acknowledges it, that evolution made the wrong turn. Now, I would say that I would disagree with that statement, because that in itself would mean that there's some kind of direction to evolution, that there's someone programming it, and that there are right turns and wrong turns, and that will be somehow going against that the whole idea of evolution. But if we take that term loosely, not meaning, more metaphorically, that something happened in the whole process of evolution, where there are now elements that somehow have helped us in being such a successful species that have invaded all of the planet, but that now that those mechanisms are now working against us. So that is something, maybe an important thing to look at. And when you look at evolution, you have what differs? What is the big difference between humans and other human primates? Other primates are the big thing was the use of tools, more sophisticated tools, reuse of tools, complexity of language. Some animals can talk a little bit, but humans have really a highly sophisticated language. And the birth in the last few thousand years of religions and organized religion to somehow explain those kind of things that you can't explain. Well, if you don't know, then you invent a god, I guess, because that can explain. So you can, and that's, I think, it's a very interesting feature. Everything that you have good explanations for, you can put into science, and those things that you cannot have good explanations for, you can put into religion. And of course, in the current society, you have another basket, which is fake news or conspiracy. So you have now another basket that you can put it in. But and I would say that conspiracy is probably similar to a form of religion. Nevertheless, the important thing about what distinguishes the human brain from the other primates is the multitude higher level of cognition, the ability of cognition. Now, and that's important, and I just want to talk a little bit more about that. I just want to check with time. Is it 10 more minutes or 5 more minutes? 5. Okay, so I have 5 more minutes. Good. So in this higher cognitive ability, certain things start to happen. Of course, you need to plan. If you want to be successful, the better you can plan, the more successful you are. So a species that has a higher ability to plan is becoming more successful. Now, I would say that is maybe where the challenges started, because we became more effective in planning. We started planning our outer life, but at a certain point, this same planning started to happen inwardly also. So what happens is in order to explain our emotions and to anticipate our emotions and to explain what we think and anything that happens internally to us, we start to make a model of that. which is then what we now call maybe the narrative self. Somehow a story about our inner life, which is on top of our inner life. And we would say that that is really where the core of the issue, the problem is, the human problem is. Because you have your actual life, your actual inner life, and then you have a layer on top that somehow classifies, judges, evaluates, plans, anticipates on all that. And I would like to make the case that this whole narrative self, this flow of symbols and the flow of classifications is thought. That's what we call thinking or thought. The flow of that is thought. And although it's perceived as a consistent whole, I feel that I'm the same as the one that was there yesterday, and you probably feel that you're the same as one who was there yesterday, but that might not be true. I think it's maybe likely it's not true. It would actually be interesting at the moment we can reset brains where there's discontinuity, and you probably still feel that you're the same person as before. But so there are a few features in this in this blueprint of how our brain works, and one feature is that we're constantly comparing. We're comparing what is with what should be. So that's the basic, and that creates psychological time. So comparing, so in order to, the brain compares what is with what should be, and that creates time. And the other one is comparing me and not me. So what is mine and what is not mine. And thirdly, there's a division being made, but I am thinking about something, as if there's a division, as if there are two things happening at the same time in the brain, as if there's a me and then it's stored separately. And so those illusions were important to be successful in planning and to anticipate, but we're seeing now that they're becoming a problem. One problem, and this is from Krishnamurti's work, one problem, he says, is a very basic problem. This planning is occupying so much space that there's no space to be present anymore. Well, somehow, we humans are part of all this. We're part of nature, we're part of the cosmos, we're part of everything. And when we're constantly preoccupied, we lose the ability to be present. We become thinking machines. It's we're trying to make computers. We're trying to create computers that can become conscious, but we're almost trying to become our brains trying to be unconscious, more and more preoccupied, which means being cut off. And Krishnamurti says that's one of the root issues of suffering, that we're cut off from all. Let me put it that way. Then there's a second part to suffering, which is that the brain is the narrative self is not a coherent thing. It's full of contradictions and fragments. It's just a collection of things that work in a certain context, but it has contradictions and fragments. There are fragments, and there are fragments. Some from these fragments contradict, and that leads to stress, to anxiety, conflict, and depression, and frustration. That is what we call psychological suffering. So that's the other element of psychological suffering. Just all because every psychological emotion, negative emotion, has its own physiological component. So feeling anxious, feeling worried, feeling frustrated, all has their physiological component. Now, we have a stress system, a physiological stress system, and this I've stolen from Robert Sapolsky, Robert Sapolsky. And he would say, and that really helped me to understand all this, he would say, yes, in primates, it's very clear. The whole stress system that they have is for predator encounters. Yeah? So you have to run away or you have to attack. And so you occasionally meet a predator, and then you run away, and your stress system is being wired up. But for humans, this same stress system is actually triggered by our whole narrative self. It constantly compares, and if it finds the two fragments find a contradiction or a stress, it sends out a stress signal, and the same physiological response comes up in our body. So, and this is ongoing. So we're in a chronic state of stress, which is then the psychological suffering. So I would say I would like to leave it here for the moment, and I think in discussion we'll go further. But I try to make somehow a mapping to how, from Krishnamurti's point of view, human suffering is being built up, and try to link that to evolution. And I feel that what we haven't addressed so far is, so how does a change come about? And I think maybe in discussion, because we have discussed this, this will come out in what is going to follow. So I'm going to ask Cory to join me here on the platform, and thank you.
Thanks, Jaap. Thank you. Hi, Cory here. So yeah, just to sort of add a little bit to the context of our conversation this morning, here at the KFA, quite a few of us have spent a lot of time before our current predicament preparing on both the theme of the theme of the gathering, which has been "Can the Mind Be Quiet?" and our preparations for the theme for a conference that would have also been occurring around now, which was focusing on individual and society. And so somehow we thought that it would be good to incorporate both of those a bit here. So what I'm going to try to do is just take a little time to point out some elements of what Krishnamurti, what we're sort of pointing out, Krishnamurti was saying about the quiet mind. And I would like to do that sort of in two ways. So what does the quiet mind mean for, or in terms of the human being? And then what implications does that have for the society as a whole? And what is the relationship between those two? Because I think that kind of helps us put those themes together. And I think through our conversations, we'll see that it's all related. And then the other caveat is that I'm here to sort of propose and represent Krishnamurti's perspective, but I am also sort of including my own thoughts. So if you really want Krishnamurti's perspective, of course, the foundations have all of it available for you to see. But in this morning, we're sort of taking that and looking at it together. So there will be the inclusions of our own interpretations and how we're looking at it on our own. So again, on the one hand, I'm looking at what are we saying about the quiet mind, and what does that mean for a human being, and then what does that mean for society as a whole? Because I think that Krishnamurti was speaking about it on both levels simultaneously, but we can sort of look at them differently because there are things that we can pick apart. So to start with, on the human being level, there's an interesting distinction that came out when we were looking at this between what Krishnamurti means by an individual and what he means by a human being. And I think it will be interesting to open this up when we look at this together, but to sort of bring that out for everyone. An individual is, Krishnamurti considers that to be sort of a local entity. So you have your interests, your desires, what you've been taught, what you've learned, where you've grown up, all of the sort of cultural influences that encompass your singular life. In a way, that's what's defined as being an individual. And in a certain sense, when we speak about change and we look at what a quiet mind is and how to attend to ourselves, what Krishnamurti is suggesting is that looking on an individual level is not enough, because looking at a level of what you care about, what you think about, what your values are, there's a much deeper level that is what is defined as a human being, which is you are sort of the incarnation of the whole stream of human evolution, and in a sense, in that sense, you contain all of it. So I may have X, Y, Z desires that sort of buzz in me, and you may have different ones. But the fact that they invigorate us and activate and enforce our action is something that we share. And at that level, that's a human level. Our separate desires and what we care about, what we think about day to day, what we choose to do and not choose to do, that's more of an individual level. So it's just to point out that when we discuss how do we change, or we ask the question, where does change occur? It's not a matter of changing beliefs or changing what you desire, but looking at the fact of how desire interacts with behavior itself and how human beings behave, that Krishnamurti is suggesting a real change can occur. So just thought that was interesting to bring out, because in terms of looking at exploring individual and society, it came out that even looking at what an individual is and how do we think about ourselves as individuals, and then when we attend to ourselves, what are we actually looking at? Are we looking at our own particular desires, beliefs, confusions, and miseries, or is there a way that we can look at how those are sort of embedded in us in a more deeper sense that's shared among us, that's not so local and unique? So then to move into more, I think one thing, and so yesterday, if you were tuning in, we had a few talks that were great about different elements of the quiet mind, and one thing that I think is interesting in looking at Krishnamurti's work is this thing about asking the right question is a very, very difficult thing. So I would propose, and this is me just as a way of illustrating this, that asking, can the mind be quiet, is actually a wrong question. Because before that question is proposed, there is a state, and that state is a state of agitation. So our minds, we're full of problems, and we're full of agitation, and that is the sort of the birthplace of a desire for peace and quietness. So, and I think that's really, there's a wonderful collection of talks where Krishnamurti goes into this very specifically, and he points to this and says that it's a mistake to look for a quiet mind, because that's an additional problem on top of the problems you already are experiencing. So the better question, or the more accurate question, is to say, how do I understand the agitations of my mind? Or what is it that elicits the desire for some peace, which somehow brings it closer to a reality and doesn't remove me again and add another problem. So I'm agitated and confused, one problem. I need a quiet mind, problem number 2. Instead of that, there's an alternative formulation which is closer to what's actually happening. So somehow I think that's a really interesting way of just refocusing what we're looking at, and I think it highlights how we are conditioned to look at problems on a whole. So typically, to take one example, if I'm afraid, I then decide that I shouldn't be afraid, or that I should cultivate courage to not be afraid, and that then I should, or XYZ. But so then, in a way, you could say that problem A, instead of looking at it and trying to actually uncover what's going on there, I've applied problem B, C, and D on top of problem A to try and somehow Krishnamurti is saying that what we don't see is that our problem-solving formula, the whole formula, is somehow incorrect, or there's a misunderstanding of our own conditioned response to ourselves that actually exacerbates our own difficulty. So we get caught in this loop. So I thought all these things I think were really interesting just to, so with that, another element of this whole thing about the quiet mind that I thought was interesting was that in many of the discussions that Krishnamurti was having with people, and I thought that honestly a lot of the discussions he had with people brought out a lot of these elements. When we think about a quiet mind, that we actually look back to moments that we've had of what we consider to be a moment of quietness, and that recognizing that alone is very interesting. Basically, is what Krishnamurti was trying to point out. That there's a point of, there's someone trying to recognize quietness, and that movement of recall is really where he's trying to point our attention to. What is the center that chooses to recall these experiences, to bring them back into focus? And that starts to move in the direction of understanding how it is that our minds are working and what it is that we're actually looking for. And recognizing how our memories are interacting with how we are attempting to interact with one another. So that, I think, is sort of the bridge into how does this whole movement of what would a quiet mind mean for society on a whole, which is put in the most simple terms, in terms of Krishnamurti's work, society is the relationship between two people. And you take that and multiply it amongst all the people that we are, that's what we have. The difficult thing that I think for us to recognize is that we want to think about society as a thing, and its thingness doesn't exist except for how we relate. So it's somehow our inability to think about relationship that confuses our ability to talk about and form society, because we want to form something. So one of the key things I think about, and there's an interesting conversation from 1948, and someone asked Krishnamurti, so can we not just lay out the basic principles of a good society, put them forward, and discuss? And he said, we could do that very easily, but what we miss is that by doing that, we've already formulated a kind of relationship that we have, both between ourselves and to what we're discussing. So his proposal is that an alternative is that we look at these things and discover those principles together, which is different than proposing them and then discussing them. So there's something there, I think, in terms of there's relationship and attention to one another is like a key to what Krishnamurti is distinguishing as a society and how an actual good society can come about. The basis, the attention somehow lies on the relationship between people, not the prescribed relationships that we hold between one another. So there's a difference there. There's just a few other things I thought to bring out. Yeah, so the other interesting bit, and it was just more of a building a bridge between, so somehow understanding the root of our own agitated minds may give us the opportunity to have some freedom from those agitations. But trying to end those agitations or to move away from them is somehow an avoidance of that understanding. If there are human beings that have some understanding of what agitation is and how that functions, then there may be the possibility of a coming together that doesn't move through those agitations to solve them, but there's a different possibility, and that possibility may be an actual kind of relationship that we aren't used to, that we don't know. So somehow I think that's kind of the bridge. And there was a really interesting quote. So why has there been in the world thousands and thousands of years of constant division? Is it because two human beings have never found out how to think together? And so I think that's a good place to leave it, is this question of, because I think we know how to think together. but do we know what that is? And do we know how to relate? And so what is relationship in the way that Krishnamurti is proposing it? And how does that look in terms of building a good society? So I'll leave it there, introduce Gianni, and then we'll open it up again.
Thank you, Cory. So I think I'll start off by just giving, as a little preface to my presentation, just a little background information on my story. I was first introduced to Krishnamurti's work as a young child, as a student at the Oak Grove School. So I actually was introduced to his work before I knew it was his work, before I knew him as an author, as a speaker, as a teacher. And I think one of the, something that I'll go over in my presentation is that wisdom or awakened intelligence is not something that can be served up and given. And so I think in that way, we're quick to put a lot of stock into institutions and to feel like they are the ones that will create a better society. And I don't think, as Jaap mentioned, that it's all one way or the other, that's a wrong assertion. But I think reflecting on my time at Oak Grove, I think one of the biggest reasons of my sense of indebtedness and gratitude for that environment is that it's about creating space, creating opportunity. And, something that struck me in your senior year at Oak Grove School, you go and you visit the sister schools in India. And I think having that experience of going and seeing the other campuses and seeing these other schools that Krishnamurti had started, you're really struck by the immense beauty that is surrounding these places. And I think beauty is something that is something very important to keep in mind when we're discussing all of these things, because when you see something that's beautiful, particularly natural beauty, you don't need anybody to tell you that it's beautiful. It's self-evident, and you feel it, and it strikes you to your core. Likewise, I was fortunate enough, the college I went to was St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is incredibly beautiful land. It's nestled sort of in the foothills there. And so again, there I was struck by the inherent beauty. And so my undergraduate education was a great books program in which we read primary sources and we have Socratic seminar-style classes. So we all do a reading and then we meet together and we discuss it for about 2 hours. And I bring in the comparison of the natural beauty because I think it gets more abstract when we deal with ideas and we deal with poets or philosophers or authors or speakers. And so the impulse there to make an authority out of something is always there, and to take someone's words or someone's work of art and say, this is it, because they got it all going on or something like that. And that misses the point, because it's not about copying or imitation, but rather it's about recognizing the beauty within these works. So I think that's the core of it. And so, you'll hear me quote several authors as well as Krishnamurti himself. And this isn't to bring them in as authorities, but rather to see the beauty in what they've made or what they've produced or what they've expressed. And so with that, I'll begin. So I did think there was some interesting connections between Cory's highlighting of the intensification of our problems when we introduce conscious control into them, as well as what Jaap brought in about how that very the contradiction within us, that sort of conflict produces stress physically within the body. And I think we didn't need to have known that scientifically, medically, before we would have recognized the truth of that, but I think it furthers that claim. So I think that would be a very interesting thing to take up in our conversation after this. So humankind is at an impasse. As a broad awakening to the mechanization that collective structures imparts upon the individual begin to unfold, a veil has been lifted to the subjugating nature of this individual spiritual oppression at the hands of these structures. The issue at stake is the very spiritual existence and transformation of humankind, both at the individual and the collective level. Surely we form societies to alleviate the burden of survival, but ideally they should also serve to awaken intelligence. This awakened intelligence comes about through the satisfaction of our most basic requirements for survival, after which we can open ourselves up to explore the nature of our existence. We are so confused by the disorder of the world, by the disorder of our own internal world, that we seek comfort and security in universals. The internal flame of desire is always attended to, for even if we constrain ourselves, we do so out of a desire to become something. It is through this desire for comfort, which can be thought of as the desire for security, that we offer ourselves as tribute upon the altar of the collective. We seek not the road less traveled, but rather the road that has been paved for us. This impulse to seek guidance, to seek support from others, is in and of itself not the issue as I see it, but it is when we become dependent on the external validation, on having the way paved for us, that begins our spiritual emptying. Nothing is more degenerative to our faculties and our spirit than to be given an answer. For when we are handed a solution, we are robbed of the vital creative exercise. As when Socrates is asked by Agathon in Plato's Symposium to sit next to him so that he can share a piece of his wisdom with him, Socrates responds, "How fine it would be, Agathon, if wisdom were a sort of thing that could flow out of the one of us who is fuller into him who is emptier by our mere contact with each other, as water will flow through wool from the fuller cup into the emptier." We also see this when Krishnamurti says that intelligence is never static. It cannot be copied and standardized and hence cannot be taught. The entire reason for being of society, for Krishnamurti, is that it exists for the fruition of man, that it exists to give freedom to the individual so that he may have the opportunity to awaken the highest intelligence. This intelligence is not the mere cultivation of a technique or of knowledge. It is to be in touch with that creative reality which is not of the superficial mind. Yet, as we have come to see, society has warped into an authoritarian system of individual oppression, where collective cooperation, herd mentality, and sameness is valued over the discovery, cultivation, and expression of individuality, subsequently hindering individual development by diminishing the importance of self-reflection. The key to sorting out the bumbling collection of desires and fears and contradictions within oneself lies in understanding oneself. But how does this self-knowledge come about? We are so accustomed to seeking the proper authority and to implement its teachings, and technologically we can do incredible things with this mechanistic mode of learning. However, when it comes to something like self-knowledge, it is utterly degenerative. We turn to the collective to guide our decisions, our livelihoods, our sense of morality, and our purpose of living. Krishnamurti rightly points out the challenges of turning away from the collective. There is this desire to follow, to imitate, to conform, in the hope of achieving something greater. And so long as this desire exists, there must be misery and strife and every form of suppression, frustration, and suffering. We look at others who have achieved a position in society or obtained something we desire, and we want what they have, and possibly even more. Envy fuels the flame of desire, which in turn prompts us to follow, imitate, and conform. Addressing this very issue, Emerson writes in his essay on self-reliance that there is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, and that he must take himself, for better, for worse, as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given to him to till. The power which resides in him is new in nature, and none but he knows that which is he can do, nor does he know until he has tried. The urge to be successful in one's society are powerful drivers, ever marching us on to adapt and to conform to any environment that might fulfill what we believe to be our desires. There is a sense of safety in numbers, and there is a sense of safety in numbers, and as members of a collective, its influence weighs heavy on us, both consciously and unconsciously. Influences which, if followed, rob us of the opportunity to cultivate self-knowledge. Carl Jung aptly highlights this tension between the individual and society regarding self-knowledge in his essay, The Undiscovered Self, when he says, "People measure their self-knowledge by what the average person in their social environment knows of himself, but not by the real psychic facts, which are, for the most part, hidden from them. In this respect, the psyche behaves like the body with its physiological and anatomical structure, of which the average person knows very little. What is commonly called self-knowledge is therefore a very limited knowledge, most of it dependent on social factors, and hence one is always coming up against the prejudice that such and such thing does not happen with us, or in our family, or among our friends and acquaintances." Now, what is to be done about this relationship to ourselves? As Jung concludes in the very same essay, to this question there is a positive answer only when the individual is willing to fulfill the demands of rigorous self-examination can he arrive at what is his own. In this light, how is it that one comes to receive this nourishing kernel of corn Emerson speaks of? For Emerson, this involved the toil bestowed on the plot of ground which is given to him to till. But what exactly does this work entail? This work is the process of unconditioning. The extent to which one is capable of completely unconditioning oneself is a question of significant importance. But I resonate with Emerson when he says that none but he knows what that is which he can do, nor does he know until he has tried. So if one is to make the attempt, how is one to untangle the vast network of conditioning in order to parse out what is our own? Such is the question which brings us to the theme of this year's gathering: can the mind be quiet? First, let's clarify the term conditioning as Krishnamurti defines it. I mean by the word conditioning all the impositions which society has laid upon us through propaganda, through insistence, through belief, through fear of heaven and hell. It includes the conditioning of nationality, of climate, of custom, of tradition, of culture. As French, Hindu, or Russian, and the innumerable beliefs, superstitions, experiences which form the whole background in which consciousness lives and which is established through one's desire to remain secure. I feel it is important to highlight here that while the word conditioning seems at the outset as to be a process which originates from the external collective onto the individual, it is in fact not as simple as mere groupthink. Krishnamurti makes this clear when he says, it forms the whole background, conditioning forms the whole background in which consciousness lives and which is established through one's desire to be secure. We all have a stake in this process on the individual and collective level, whether we are aware of it or not. This lends further support to the inward revolution Krishnamurti speaks of and his insistence that for lasting change to occur within society, it must first be done individually. This conditioning lies deep within our unconscious and thus colors our conscious self, our reactions, and our feelings. Moreover, Krishnamurti spoke of the unconscious as that which cannot be approached by the conscious. Through dreams, through hints, through symbols, through various forms of intimation, the unconscious tries to communicate with the conscious mind. These hints and intimations require interpretation, and the conscious mind interprets them according to its conditioning. So there is never complete contact between the two, and never complete understanding of the unconscious. It is something that we don't quite know in its entirety, and yet without understanding and being free of the unconscious, with its burden of history, the whole long story of the past, there will always be a contradiction, a conflict, a battle raging within. If this is indeed true, again, what is to be done? Jung notes in the aforementioned essay that in this broad belt of unconsciousness, which is immune to conscious criticism and control, we stand defenseless, open to all kinds of psychic infections. It is perhaps here that we are in need of the quiet mind, not to solve any particular problem, for one cannot simply force the mind into quietude. Rather, the quieting of the mind is an activity in self-knowledge, an activity which creates a receptive conscious landscape in which we can slow down and become aware of our thinking and our feeling. During a talk in Ojai on June 11th in 1944, Krishnamurti spoke on the importance of observing oneself in this solitude. In order to understand ourselves, we must become aware, and to study ourselves, thought-feeling must itself slow down. If you become aware of your own thinking and feeling, you will perceive how rapid it is, one disconnected thought-feeling following another, wandering and distracted, and it is impossible to examine such confusion. To bring order and so clarity, I suggested that every thought-feeling be written down. This whirling machinery must slow itself down to be observed, so writing every thought-feeling may be of help. As in a slow-motion picture, you are able to see every movement. So in slowing down the rapidity of the mind, you are then able to observe every thought, trivial and important. The trivial leads to the important, and do not brush it aside as being petty. Since it is there, it is an indication of the pettiness of the mind, and to brush it aside does not make the mind any the less trivial, stupid. To brush it aside helps to keep the mind small, narrow, but to be aware of it, to understand it, leads to great riches. If any of you have tried to write as I suggested a couple weeks ago, you will learn how difficult it is to put down every thought and feeling. You will not only use a lot of paper, but you will not be able to write down all of your thought feelings, for your mind is too rapid in its distractions. But if you have the intention of putting down every thought feeling, however trivial and stupid, the shameful and the pleasant, however little you may succeed at first, you will soon discover a peculiar thing happening. As you have not the time to write every thought feeling, for you have to give your attention to other matters, you will find that one of the layers of consciousness is recording every thought feeling, though you do not give your attention directly to write down. Nevertheless, you are inwardly aware. And when you have time to write again, you will find that the recordings of inward awareness will come to the surface. If you will look over what you have written, you will find yourself either condemning or approving, justifying or comparing. This approbation or denial prevents the flowering of thought feeling, and so stops understanding. If you do not condemn, justify, or compare, but ponder over, try to understand, then you will discover that these thought feelings are indications of something much deeper. So you are beginning to develop the mirror which reflects your thought feelings without any distortion. And by observing them, you are comprehending your actions and responses, and so self-knowledge becomes wider and deeper. You not only comprehend the present momentary action and reaction, but also the past that has produced the present. And for this you must have quiet and solitude. In this process of self-awareness, you will discover many things about yourself and so of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we open it up to a discussion?
Yes, Cory and I will begin, so you can be retold. Maybe first thing I maybe have to say also for people who are watching, we didn't know what each of us was going to say. We had been, of course, we're in communication with each other, but we're not. We haven't exchanged. So this the exchange that will follow is not a pre-trained thing or something. There's no. We haven't worked on that. So we really kind of work things out and think it through together in a real way. The first thing I like to ask Cory is if you can say a little bit more about something that really intrigues me also about Krishnamurti, about when he talks about humanness versus individuality. And you talked a bit about it, but I wonder if you can say more about that.
Yeah, I also think it's really interesting, and it's so to put it in context, most of the time this distinction came out when his discussions were around how a change in society takes place. And to paraphrase a quote, something like, merely a change in one's little backyard will probably not be enough. But so that somehow what we're discussing is, or what Krishnamurti is looking at and what we're discussing is that there may be a capacity for the whole human mind as it's arranged and the way that it structures how it lives in the world to change at that level. And not and I think the easiest way to contrast that is to say that it's not a matter of changing what we think about or what we care about or what we focus on, but it's a matter of understanding how what we think about and what we care about and what we believe in influences our behavior in the world and our relationship at that level.
Could you repeat that?
I don't know if I can repeat it, but I can. So it's a distinction between changing. So on the one hand, we could be discussing changing what we think about, what we believe in, what our values are, and what we decide to implement in the world. We could discuss on that level. But I think the suggestion is that the only change in that will influence a change on a societal level has to be a change at a different level, which is the change at the level of how does a thought process and the structure of beliefs and values and desires, an understanding of that whole process may influence a kind of change in the structure of the human mind that's before the content of desires and beliefs and values.
But are you suggesting that that you or that you read Krishnamurti's work as there's a kind of base structure that is shared, that's common, and that things emerge from that somehow?
Yeah, exactly. So it's that structure. And I think that's the difficulty, is that it's much easier for us to discuss the differences between what you and I think, or you may feel this way about one certain topic, I feel this way about this certain topic.
Yeah. That's content-wise, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So it's more about understanding how those feelings and values influence the whole. So there's a much deeper structure to human beings, and we are each exactly that structure. Like, so the particularities of our uniqueness on an individual level have no real influence on, if we're discussing trying to look at a different possibility of society and changing society, changing anything on that level has little or no influence.
Now, suppose that is true, right? That there is an underlying structure. Then this must be a mechanism that's already in place and already happening throughout our history, right? That somehow, I assume that structure has been changing. So do you have anything to, I mean, if to substantiate that? Is there any evidence for that? Do you feel any mechanisms? You know, I mean, I know Krishnamurti would say, well, look at certain individuals and how they influence the world. Or
I don't know. I think the question is it possible for us to be able to attend to that structure? Yeah. I think that's kind of the thing. Because we're used to attending to the details. You like this, I think this, we agree on this, we disagree on this. We're used to that level. But I think the question of, I think we could speculate whether or not that structure exists and whether or not it's changed. But I think the question is, can we actually, is there a capacity for our attention to avail us of that information so that we're aware of it somehow and bring it into our ability to relate to one another?
Yeah, I can, you know, I mean, from my reading of Krishnamurti's work, I remember an instance where he says something that if something has been done by one person somewhere, it's available to everybody. You know, I mean, and that was happening in the time he spoke with this Rupert Sheldrake, right? Morphologic resonance. I never know if that was the same thing, but somehow that there's a kind of human learning, right? And the other thing he would say, well, see how certain individuals, how strongly they have affected humanity, like Hitler, he would say, or Buddha, or Jesus Christ, or so he took that as another example of, and the third one would be where he would say that in question and so how would humanity change? He said, well, we just need a critical mass. If 3 or 4 people, he would say literally between 3 to 10 people would radically change and free themselves, the whole world would change. That would somehow have an effect. So I don't know. I mean, that's just from his work. It would actually be interesting if there was something like because I mean, you would still wonder then what kind of elements would be would be viral. Let me put it that way, and what kind of elements would not be viral, right? Maybe there's some kind of laws to that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we should bring Gianni in, but I think that what that brings out, and I think it's a critical component of all of this, is the difference between repetition and some sort of authentic understanding. So we're very good at repeating something we think is the right thing. But to come from a place of understanding and genuinely being able to relate from there, I think that's the open question. Can we do, what is that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, when we're on the level of discussing this as, you know, on the level of society, right? I mean, I think you do run the risk or the consequence of those that do probe a bit deeper, right? And let's say they're not as collectively minded, but they have explored these things for themselves. I feel like there's another quagmire that then is presented, which is, I have found this for myself. Now let me build up around it because I've made a connection. It is true. You know, I've investigated it myself. Now let me, you know, reform the law around that and bring my countrymen or bring, you know, the whole world into that system.
Organize
right?
it.
Organize it, right? I mean, that was certainly a very large idea within antiquity, right? I mean, especially the Romans of saying we are going to civilize the world, right? The barbarians are this, you know, unenlightened beings, you know, but we can civilize them through our sort of what we've found and what we believe. And I mean, that happens on the political, the military level, but I mean, certainly we've seen it also with religion and spirituality. And So I think that becomes the real question is one is the discovery for oneself, but then also that impulse to then say, okay, let's mass produce this, you know.
On the opposite end of that, I think it's like the other side of the coin is that inside of us there is an insecurity about our own existence in the world that sort of is there open for someone to explain the right way. Or for does that, so somehow we're like
two poles of the magnet.
There's something in me that says I've got it, this is the thing, and then there's this other side of me that says I don't know, but I'm ready to hear it. Because if I have it, then I'm good. It's this whole thing about authority and security is somehow,
Yeah, it's really good. No, I just want to bring it, and I think that's because how, you know, if you look at conditioning and the human mind and its whole reflex mechanism, the brain as reflex mechanism, programmed in a certain way or having a kind of blueprint, and I mean, it's clear for those who have read Krishnamurti's work that he suggests that the change can come about through the observation, the choiceless observation of that. And so that's one element, and then he has gone a little bit further in saying, well, so what is happening, right? So he says, and which was for most of the part really a mystery to me, because he somewhere says, well, thought can realize its own limitations, right? And that seems to be really so. But that's a strange statement, of course. Like thought as a mechanical process can realize its own, can see its own limitation, because there's no seeing in a mechanical process. So it's only recent, and also in the discussions that we had, where we looked at that even within mathematics you can prove, in any mathematical system can prove its own limitations somehow, that it actually becomes more likely that it's possible for thought as a string of symbols and axioms, in a way, which can somehow realize that it's limited and has a confined space, and there might be truth outside of that limitation somehow. I don't know where I want to go with that, but I thought it's important, because you want to see where's the crack in this illusion, right? How does that come about?
Something I think that is related to that, and where I think the difficulty is that I think it comes down to this whole question of observation, because we have a difficulty letting, if we could possibly let our whole thinking process be exactly as it is, that may be a very clear possibility. But there's something in us that isn't satisfied with letting it be. It's we either judge what we're thinking, or compare what we're thinking, or feel like there's some interaction with the thinking process that is the confusion. So does that make sense?
Yes.
There may be some clarity if the whole process were able to just be what it is, but that the difficulty is that there's something in us that demands that we do something. And that introduces the confusion.
And I wonder if that issue that you have highlighted, right, is only magnified when we're talking about something like a society or a group of people, right? I mean, if I'm already struggling to deal with my own irrational elements, then I will have even less tolerance or patience for your irrational elements. Or perhaps vice versa, right? I mean, perhaps I'm more tolerant of yours, but more exacting on my own. But there's still that element of when we're dealing with others, that, we can have some sort of structure to that, right? Some sort of like, this is what I need from you, this is what you need from me, or this is how we can come together. And I mean, I think it's that we want that security of consistency, and we want that security. And so I think that really is a big driver of this issue, because then we start getting into the masses amounts of people, and we start differing with our opinions, and our values, which touch us very deeply, start to differ. And then we start, becoming less and less tolerant, because it's so deeply entrenched.
But that's I feel that's an important point, because so we're modeling ourselves. We have a layer that tries to predict and anticipate somehow our feelings, right? And our emotionality. But in the same way, of course, I have to have a model of you. Where are you? I have to see, and so how I model myself, I'm also trying to make a model of you and somehow anticipate, well, he likes me, he doesn't like me, he's rejecting this, he's not rejecting this. So I'm in my own model is tracking, where is Gianni now? So and obviously, and I feel that's what Krishnamurti talks about when he talks about images in relationship. That is what my relationship with you is, my relationship with my idea of you, right? My model of you, which is based upon how I perceive myself.
I think definitely the relationship, Krishnamurti calls it the mirror of relationship, right? Which it certainly seems that way. I mean, one of the questions with the online course I've been working on was asking the participants of the course to reflect on their own self-image, and then also how that their self-image, when they reflect on it, how that image is influenced or informed by how others think of them. And so then we get a very interesting thing where I'm looking at you, I'm analyzing how you're reacting to me, both to sort of try to understand you, but also to understand how, you and how you think of me, right? And so then, of course, I think we've all had the experience where we bump into people who maybe they think they're smarter than they are, or cooler than they are, or whatnot, and so there is a disconnect between their own self-image and, they have to find the right people to cater to them, right? But I think on a whole, there's more of a reflection and a balance, right? Where I'm looking for you, and that's informing my own image, and it's sort of the hall of mirrors,
There's some, in looking at, especially, so to bring it back to like this whole question of a quiet mind and a mind being agitated by problems and solving problems. There were many instances where Krishnamurti says that primarily they are problems of relationship. Your relationship to whatever it is. And so that brings it a step closer, which is to say that that typically the way we approach a problem is already, in a sense, flawed, because our own center of response is the beginning of the problem and the source of the choices that complexify it. So, but it's difficult for us to go there because we're used to focusing on it as something that's distinct from us. So how is it that we attend to the whole thing, which means how do I attend to to my own interaction with what I think is an issue, whether it be I think you know or know less, it's somehow, does that make sense?
Yeah, the assessment that's been made.
The assessment is still further from what's going on. but to approach it in a way that's, how do we understand that?
Well, the thing is, of course, that assessment is being made, but it's unconscious to you. You're making that assessment,
Yes.
operating from the assessment.
Yes.
It's implemented, it's actualized in your relationship, but you're not aware that you're actualizing that. You see, that seemed to be the hidden spot.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if we want to take some questions, bring in some questions from the audience, because it's you have 5 minutes left. Or 10 minutes left, okay. Thanks. I mean, I think we have enough things to say, but I just wondered if there's something we would like to bring out from what other people have seen in this fishbowl, right? Looking at it from the outside. Mm.
So one question is, sorry, there's a few. I'm just.
Yeah.
So, is it that only a silent mind can come upon insight, or is it insight that creates a silent mind? In a way, I think that's sort of has to do with looking at what it is that we're looking at, like asking the right question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
So,
yes.
Why? What? To look for a silent mind is one thing, right? And typically that's because my mind is not silent, which means somehow I'm agitated or confused.
So you're posing something, some new state,
Yeah.
which is labeled silent mind.
Yeah.
So I am here, and I want to be there.
Yeah. And I mean, at least in terms of the conversations Krishnamurti was having, it's a very natural outcome of understanding agitation that the agitation ends. So it's almost like an unfortunate byproduct of listening to someone that speaks about a quiet mind. Then the question of a quiet mind becomes a thing that we can pose to ourselves.
Yeah, but I would like to add something, because I think this does point to a certain thing that we have encountered quite a bit in looking at Krishnamurti's work, that there's a circularity to it. Like, in order to observe, you start to understand, and from that understanding brings freedom. But in order to observe, you need to be free. So and there are quite a few of those circular arguments. If you start to try to put them in a flowchart, and I feel this is more or less that, right? In order to have a quiet mind, you need to have insight. And in order to have insight, you need to have a quiet mind. So that's now what is true.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think that's true. But somehow I feel like that illustrates the difficulty in asking a real question.
Yes.
Because because a real question somehow seems to point to, or at least open a door to looking at something, versus moving away from something in pursuit of something else.
Yes.
I mean, I wonder, though, if there's not a certain way out of the circularness of it. Because going through Krishnamurti's work, he speaks a lot on the importance and the power of beauty in truth, right? I mean, there'll be plenty of instances where he'll say, we're not debating, we're not exchanging ideas, we're looking at what is true, and when we come upon it in dialogue, we will see it as we are struck with beauty.
Yes, yes.
And so I wonder, in that circularness, right, of do I have insight and then a quiet mind, or do I have a quiet mind and that leads to insight? I wonder, though, when we talk about things as true, or maybe the more, I think, common or frequent experience is when we encounter beauty, is that there's a certain awe that's connected with beauty. And I wonder if in that moment of recognizing beauty or perceiving beauty, that there isn't this awe. And for me, awe doesn't come with racing thoughts and like, what are the implications of this? It comes with a sort of space and a silence that's like the observation of it. So I wonder if that's not also, maybe a slightly a way out of a strictly circular nature of it.
So you're saying, okay, we're having the thought machine, as Stephen put it yesterday, right? The thought machine. And it appears that there's only the thought machine, thought responding to itself, but that there's something in as our humanness which is more than a thought machine, and that beauty somehow, although maybe registered in the thought machine, but that beauty somehow reaches somewhere else, right? And that in a similar way that. As a capacity, not as a thought machine recording, but as a capacity to see something that is true. But I mean, that would be a very interesting aspect to discover more, right? Because how do you go about that, exploring that in a non-romantic way, without introducing a higher self, or a soul, or other belief-based notions? I think it's. We have a few more minutes.
We have a few minutes. Yeah.
So it's a. I think that's a great discussion to have. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That kind of relates to this question on a little bit of a different level, but is relationship sort of what is already present before we try to create it or define it? So we've been speaking about this thing about coming together and creating a society and all these things. Somehow I think relationship and beauty are related in that way.
So what's the question?
Is relationship what is already present before we try to define or create it?
Well, certainly it's got to be there, right? I mean, we can put all kinds of different flourishes on it and make it transactional or make it, however we want, contractual or whatnot. But certainly there must be some foundation, right? That serves to then be able to add on to.
But what is that then? What is that foundation then?
I mean, it all stems from our being, right? I mean, your being, my being. And then when we come together, it's our being.
Well, I think Stephen yesterday used the word communion somewhere, right? That there's a sense of a possibility of exchange, which is not necessarily on the verbal level but that you can commune in something and speak from that. I don't know if it is maybe pointing to something like that, or is that?
Yeah, somehow I think it has to do because particularly in understanding what it means to be together and think together, even if we presuppose that relationship exists before we show up, somehow we still, it seems more like somehow we're enacting it and doing it, relating, or we're not. I'm responding to you as I think you are, and does that make sense? Somehow it feels like a very active thing. This whole business about discussing relationship, I think, is really tricky because we want to call it a thing. We want to talk about relationship as though it's something, but the fact is it's not. The only way it's we only relate in real time. Otherwise, it's something formulaic, and that's why I think it's difficult to discuss somehow.
And just to see it's.
So I think we're out of time. There is a link. We're going to take a lunch break. There's a link underneath the streaming portion of the site if you're tuning in online, where there's videos that you can tune into. There's immeasurable videos and some Oak Grove School videos, I think, that you can see during the lunch break. Otherwise, we'll be back at 1 p.m. with David Moody.
Thank you very much.